to get started. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Nathaniel, and Nathaniel's the president of the Quantum Computing Club at RPI, and he's going to give us our Intro to Quantum course. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Mr. Mueller, for putting us all together. I just wanted to go over just a brief introduction to the entire field. There's a lot of stuff that there's a lot of mystification around quantum in general. There's a lot that you can kind of hear online just about what it can and can't do. And we just kind of go through here and cover a bit on what is useful about this, what it can do, and what we think it's going to be useful for in the future. You can kind of see here the large chandelier-looking thing with a bunch of wires. So that's kind of what the quantum computer looks like on the inside. You basically have the chip that's at the very bottom, and you have a lot of wires and cooling to basically keep this thing very, very cold, so we can use it. So the first question is, what is this useful for, right? There's a lot of great theory work that goes into quantum computing, but a lot of that theory work is not really helpful for the average person. We want something to be able to do with this. We don't want something that can just do some physics experiments, which is very useful for the world, but also not very useful for, let's say, designing an aircraft wing. Okay, so the groundwork has been laid, and now we're getting to the point where we can get to applications. So the first one we're going to go through, is VQE. So VQE is a application that simulates stuff. So it simulates physical interactions between objects, chemistry work. And you can see basically what you're doing with this is making new drugs, modeling aircraft wings. So let's say you want to design a new drug. Either you can go through a very long period of design, testing, and simulating the...
Sounds like it's not loud enough.
Okay, so VQE, right? We're designing drugs here. We're simulating the physical objects. And that's very, very nice for, like, if you think it's like, but if we wanted to use this cancer treatment on someone in the real life, we have to basically design it. Then we have to kind of create the actual chemicals and mix it all together. And then we still have to go through all the physical testing of putting this on people. And that takes a very long time. So having algorithms that we can simulate these things is very, very useful. Now, you may be thinking, okay, what's the problem with just using like regular computers here? Basically, the more complicated your system, the exponentially scaling this will take. So if you have like one little thing you want to simulate, that'll take a little bit of time. But if you add 2 and then 3, there's more and more interactions that make this more and more complicated until we get to a point where you can no longer use a regular computer. So that's where VQE and quantum computing comes in. We can use a certain optimization algorithm to basically sample and test these new materials and drugs before we actually have to make them in real life. The next one I want to talk about here is RSA encryption. So there's an algorithm that we use to keep all our data safe in the internet. It's called RSA encryption. What it does is basically you're going to take the data that you want to have safe, and you're going to basically take a key, and you're going to encrypt your data. And the hope is that once you encrypt your data, nobody's going to be able to decrypt it. And for a while, that was the case, because the RSA encryption works on taking very large prime numbers and putting them together. And that's really, really hard to basically decrypt regularly. The thing we have learned recently in the past few years is that we can use a quantum algorithm to basically decrypt it. So we can basically take this really, really hard problem and solve it because of this computer. So we can basically take this very large problem that is basically based on encrypting things with large numbers, and we can solve it really fast. And this is a problem because if you can imagine, the entire internet is held because of these prime numbers that are put together. And we're going to break that down. We can break that down pretty fast compared to if we use a regular computer. This would take, like the heat death of the universe to basically solve these problems. But if you basically use a quantum computer, you can get that done in a lot less time. So the field is just coming around is basically solving these problems by basically making new encryption methods that avoid that, to make sure that your data stays safe. But also you can kind of see immediately there's a lot of impact from that. Like that means we have to basically change all encryption algorithms that rely on methods like this and find a way to make it safe from future attacks. So the next thing that we want to kind of talk about here is that there's other physical devices that are useful. So if you have, let's say you want to navigate your submarine, right? And you submerge and you don't want to get detected. So you're not going to come up for a long time. And if you don't want to come up for a long time, you basically need to be accurately know where you are underwater. So how we're going to use that, we're going to measure the acceleration of our submarine. We're going to see basically how fast it's traveling and try to figure out where we are to make sure we don't have to come up. Because if we come up and you're in enemy waters, you're going to get detected and then possibly shot down. The problem is that, let's say you're measuring your acceleration. So over time, that device, like that sensor, is going to drift. And as it drifts, your position is less and less known until basically you don't know if you're on one side of the channel or the other. And at that point, you need to come up because you need to basically know your position so you don't crash into a cliff. One of the developments that's happening is that we're finding new sensors and new ways to basically use quantum mechanics in sensor design to basically have more accurate measurements of certain things. Now, whether that's acceleration, whether that's, if you can look in the top right, you can see these nanodiamonds, these small little diamonds that we will basically put into cells. And they allow us to basically measure physical properties of cells and get useful information out of that. And this is super, super useful, especially if you're looking at, you can measure all these specific things about inside an individual cell with an accuracy much, much higher than you could without being able to stick the actual sensor inside the cell. And this is useful for medical thermometry. You want to accurately know a patient's temperature. It's useful for like MRIs, which you're basically using like massive magnets to measure the inside of people. And then you've got other stuff that is basically these, where you can take these kind of quantum sensors, you can basically put them into applications that are much, much more, that are more accurate and kind of more easily, you can get a more accurate sensor at a much, much smaller scale. And you can put it into a very, very useful places. So this is the quantum internet. We were talking about how we can basically break prime numbers. We can basically take these large problems and cut them into little bits. The utility of this is that we can basically take our information and encode it in a way that it can't be broken. We want to put it use these networks of basically light, and you can encode your information in these little bits of light, and you can basically send them around to different places. And because it's not relying on a breakable method, you can get information securely from one place to another. So the design that's happening right now is trying to take this very safe way of putting information into one method and then transmit it to another location. And there's other methods as well. So let's say you've got like a satellite. You're going to shoot a little bit of light to that satellite, and then you're going to shoot it back down to somewhere else. So that, if you're using entangled light, so you're basically taking two little dots of light, putting them together, and then you're going to send them to different locations. When you do that, you can basically get your information from one place to another very, very safely. And you don't have to worry about using one of the method we described earlier, which is like using encryption methods that can be broken or might be broken in the future. So basically what we can see is that we're solving physical problems, then we're breaking information and being able to extract information from stuff that you would like to not have information extracted from. So we're building new methods to cover that. Then we're basically designing new sensors that we can see to determine physical properties, and that's useful for myriad applications. And then we're seeing that we're building new methods to transmit information faster and more efficiently. And this kind of comes back to just the general theory of quantum information, which I just want to take a bit to describe. So regular computers have bits. So bits basically are ones or zeros. In a quantum system, it's not the same. You basically can have it's either on, off, or a combination of both. You basically have the probability of it being in one state or the other. You don't have it being as just one state or the other. So this basically allows us to have a much larger space to explore. It's a superposition of all the possible outcomes. So a lot of what the advantage in the ways that we're getting from these previous algorithms that we kind of touched on is basically instead of using like ones or zeros, using the entire large space that you get from having just the probability of stuff happening. So I don't want to go deep into the theory here. It's just generally I want to make it clear that the way that we're kind of getting the advantage from these computers, because you have such a large space to explore, and the kind of uniqueness that gives you lets you extract more information from certain operations that kind of work on this entire state rather than doing one operation at a time. So a lot of these algorithms, instead of doing like flipping ones and zeros, you're basically doing something that works on the entire space, the entire like probability of this occurring. Theory is great, and I think this is very simple. This is the overview of the entire kind of field, somewhat. But you want to see what happens. You want to see this a little more in action. And for that, we're going to use a little thing called the max cut problem. So let's say you've got like this little graph, right? You've got these 5 nodes, and you want to cut it into 2 equal groups. So this is like a little bit of a small problem. It doesn't immediately seem like it has large implications. But if you want to put some other problem in terms of this, you can make something that's more significant. So let's say, for instance, each one of those nodes, you can see the little dots, right? And each one of those nodes is like a financial transaction. Okay. And then the kind of edges that connect each one of those nodes shows you just like how suspicious that transaction is. Now you're basically trying to evaluate how suspicious any transaction is. And you can basically put that in terms of this problem. And as it scales up, you can basically use it to evaluate how suspicious transactions are and basically detect fraud. And it's got some other potential works. You've got network design. You can analyze like social media networks. So let's say detecting like who's friends and who's like what groups are together. You can design circuits. If you measure like its wires and task prioritization. And here I can go over to here and show you the actual demo. One thing that's very, very nice about this, about quantum computing, is that you don't need much to really do it. You only need a bit of knowledge with Python. Python is great. It's very high level. And for like students taking this now and learning a bit about it, there's a lot of efficient things you can call. For instance, there's like a function you can call is basically like Shor's algorithm. So all that kind of complicated stuff, the complicated stuff that has to do with, let's say, decrypting prime numbers, you don't really need to know the theory of how it works on the inside. You can basically just jump straight to the application phase, and you can take your knowledge of just generally what it does, and then find a problem to apply it to. And that's the advantage of basically having this in Python. So that even though some of this is has a lot of stuff going on, you can understand what's happening at a very high level without having to go and understand all the complex math behind it. So you can see here that this first section, what we're doing is basically building the little graph that we're talking about. So this, if you imagine, that's the financial transactions, that's the suspiciousness, and then we're importing some other stuff. So what we're doing is basically you're setting up your nodes, you're building it all up, and then what's going to happen is that you're going to set up the way to optimize this. So we're going to use QAOA, which is a specific optimization algorithm that we have to basically find the maximum number of cuts we can make. So if you look at this graph, right, what you can see is that there's a lot of different cuts you could make. You could cut through, let's say, that triangle. If you just cut through right here, you would separate it into 2 groups, but it wouldn't be a very good cut because you're putting one node alone and then 4 others in a different group. That wouldn't be optimal. So what we're trying to do is, since we're trying to find the maximal cut, which there's only so many possibilities on this small graph. You can imagine if it gets to 30 nodes and a lot more edges, it's going to be impossible to do by hand. But you can basically cut this into its 2 equal groups. And that's basically what we're optimizing here with QAOA. Okay, so now it's going to this is basically building our circuit. And you can see it's basically got a lot of operations. And you can see all those operations are here in this little graph. And if I zoom in, you can see it's basically these are the operations that were being done on that space. And then we basically the convenience of Python and the convenience of having this kind of system on campus means I can just import a couple things and then send this job to the cloud. And the cloud will basically put it onto the computer. And I don't need to be anywhere near this computer. Just by the virtue of being part of the school and having access to the computer, I can just send this job, it'll run. If we look at, let's say, go to the platform right now, you can see that right now, because we're on spring break at the moment, you'll see that there's 0 current jobs pending. Now, if we go and look at, let's say, I don't know, let's go to other computers. In total, there's only a few that are online. You can see, let's say, this one. Total pending jobs, 605. All the researchers that want to work on this have to generally go through these systems that anybody can access. But the benefit is that this little job that I run here, I only have to basically compete with the RPI people on this. And we can see that here's what happens when you run it. And it's going to slowly optimize towards by running a bunch of jobs. Because you're working with this probability thing, you have to sample it a bunch of times to get the accurate result. So then slowly getting towards the right answer. And then you'll see you'll basically get all the stuff out. It'll finish it. You'll do some sampling. And then it'll show you your most likely result. If we go here, you can see this nice graph, right? So this is all those jobs that you're running. And now that once you've run it all, it's basically saying that these purple ones are your most likely result. So this is the most likely to give you the best result. And now, if we look at that and plot it, and then you see what the value is 5. Well, we could have figured out this problem very, very fast on our own by just drawing a couple cuts and figuring out just on paper. But again, it's like as you scale this up and you start to get to 30 nodes and then to 40 or way, way more, it becomes impossible to use a regular computer, and you have to use a quantum computer. Because if you think about it, let's go back to the kind of final thing to touch on is you've got your 1 and 0, and you've got your quantum state, which basically has all the possible states. So you've got like 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, and 1, 0. Right? That's the 4 possible combinations if you flipped your like 2 coins. That takes, if you wanted to use like a regular bits, that would take 4 bits, but it would take just 2 quantum bits, right? And now if you scale that more, then you start to scale basically 2 to the n, where you've got like a regular computer scales 2 to the n number of bits for your n qubits. So that scales exponentially. And that means that the more complex the problem, the less possible it is for us to do it with a regular computer. And yeah, I think that generally touches on the general subject and some applications and a little demo. Thank you.
We're going to invite the panelists up now.
Because I don't know anything about quantum computing, and I've been studying it for about 7 or 8 weeks, and I think I'm going backwards, because this morning I was like looking at the topological qubit, and when I realized it had antimatter, I got lost. So I'm Chris Argyropoulos. I graduated RPI in '85. I got a master's degree at MIT and spent my career pretty much as an entrepreneur in investing, hedge funds, particularly on the short side, betting against technologies that didn't work. And there's actually quite a few of those. To my left, we've got Mark Weiss, who's an absolute expert. He's also an investor. He's a crossover investor, which means he does both public and private venture type of investing. And he's been following quantum for many years. So he's, at least on the Wall Street side, he's one of the much more knowledgeable people. Lucy's a professor at RPI, and she's actually helping develop master's program in quantum computing, and you should feel free to ask her about that. Brian is one of RPI's foremost experts. He went to RPI. Did you do both undergrad and grad school?
They couldn't get rid of me.
And he's still there, thank goodness. He really understands everything about quantum computing that you could possibly understand. He's a nuclear physicist, and he might be able to tell you what antimatter is, because I'm not doing it. Bob Bedard is a systems process expert and entrepreneur, and he's been very instrumental in helping RPI build out its local ecosystem. One of the new things that President Schmidt's trying to do is increase community engagement, increase employment so he's working with companies like Micron Technology to bring jobs into the Capital District near RPI, keep the jobs there, and really just keep the intellectual capital there. We educate the capital, why not keep it there and grow the ecosystem? Did anyone else have anything to add via bios or anything? Did I get all of that right?
Yeah.
I couldn't be more excited about a technology for humanity. I think this, if it works, and it looks like it's going to work, if you talk to the experts, you've got Jensen Huang from NVIDIA saying it's going to be there in 15 years. You've got other experts saying as little as 5 years. So nobody really knows. But what this is going to do, this is going to revolutionize drug discovery in a way that you couldn't imagine. So for every 100 drugs, we're probably going to develop 10,000. It's going to be geometric. I'm interested in what it's going to do for battery technology. I think when you're looking at global warming, we haven't been able to make good advances in battery technology and storage, so we don't know what to do at night or when the wind doesn't blow. This might fix it. And for those of you that don't know, we'll get to the real experts, but Google announced they did a calculation in a few minutes that would take, what, 10 septillion years to do? And it's the parallel nature and the geometric nature of how fast these calculations can be done, which is why this is so exciting. What are the applications that you're excited about?
I think you already hit on a couple of them. Drug discovery is a nightmare. Depending on which numbers you look at, it's 6 to 7 or 10%. When you start a drug, you file an IND with the FDA, and then you go through your phase 1, 2, and 3. And from the IND to a successful phase 3, you're talking 7-10%. And it's $1 to $2 billion in 12 years. With the phase 3, and the phase 2, using humans as guinea pigs with a quantum computer. I believe ultimately, after it's going to take a while, but we should be able to get drugs that work 90, 100%. So taking that terrible low rate and getting it up by over a factor of 10 would be just monumental. And that 12-year period, I think, could be shortened. I think you might get it down to only a couple of years, because I think ultimately with a quantum computer, you might be able to feed in the DNA of every person in the world and do your phase 3 in the computer. And you have to it's going to take a while to convince regulators that works, but ultimately I think it can. And then we can get out of this horrible thing of using humans as guinea pigs. But through another application, I think the battery technology is right, but I think ultimately it's really about, really think of tech. We've really been driven, an IT-driven tech. It's been Moore's Law, and you look at the top market cap companies in the world, they're all based on traditional computing and managing data. And what's behind is hard science stuff. The ability to, quantum computing has been evading us for a long time. Fusion is always seems like it's 10, 30 years, well, 30 to 50 years out in the future. And it's been that way for the last 30 years. So hasn't really gotten much better. But just as an example, I think there's a very good fusion firm in this area called Commonwealth. And they figured out how to make high temperature superconductors that can operate, I think, at 20 degrees above absolute zero. And that led to a 40-fold increase in the economics, because to cool these things down to close to 0 Kelvin, really expensive. And it makes the break even on fusion impossible. So what if you got a room temperature superconductor? A real room temperature superconductor to handle lots of current, make incredibly high Tesla strong magnets. Then we make it, fusion may become the cheapest and the most plentiful and the lowest carbon footprint energy source. And I think the only way we're really going to get there is with a quantum computer.
Down in the end, Bob, how do you think this is going to change the job market for students? What do you think that this is going to mean for young people entering their educational and their careers?
First of all, I think the timing's great. If you listen to a lot of the time frames of when people say stuff is going to become much more commercially viable, they talk 3-5 years type of time frame. And anyone who's going to be going to college now and 4 years from now, you're going to be right in the thick of things. So the timing is absolutely perfect, quite frankly. We think we're 5 years away. We think that's a long time. But when you go through school, it's going to fly by. The job market's interesting because even now, if you listen to IBM, they've done some presentations about there's more demand now for folks that are quantum literate than there's more job opportunities than there are students out there, more people out there, quite frankly. So there's a demand right now. Most of the jobs, I would say now, are lower in the technology stack, research, trying to figure out error detection, error correction, those types of things, because that's where a lot of the focus is. But over time, as the technology develops, just like any other computing technology, it's going to move up the value chain and up the technology stack to where you build applications, build algorithms, and really the value, 90% of the market value is going to be in the applications that you build on these things. And that's wide open. Of course, for the most part, these technology companies don't even have that technology stack fully developed yet. But hopefully in the next 3-5 years, when that comes along, it's just going to really blow up in the market in terms of being able to create applications. And the great thing is that you don't have to be a physicist. Like, this is going to touch every industry. And so just being aware of what quantum computing is all about, regardless of what your major is, it's going to touch it. And you should try to understand how it's going to touch it and find those opportunities.
You may or may not know, but RPI is one of the few universities in the world that actually has a quantum computer. So we have a little bit of early mover advantage. And as it was shown, we don't have to compete with 650 other people waiting on a queue. And really, we're all learning about it. Lucy, what does that mean for the ecosystem of RPI and ultimately the students?
I think there's no better time than now. That's for sure. The last year or two since we got this computer on campus, there have been a lot of activities going on campus in terms of the educational component. So it's not just research. Research for sure, there's so much work to be done. In fact, one of my PhD students got so interested in this, and she took Brian's class and actually made this like a puzzle model type of toy as one of her side project. She's just so excited. So that's on the research component, but on the educational side, we are building all levels of degree programs. But even without a degree program, we have already, I think, 10 plus courses across the campus for people to take at all different levels, at undergraduate level, at the graduate level. So there are a lot of resources that our RPI has already put in to put like different levels of courses and curriculum building type of activities that's been going on. One of my early interests I do computational work, classical computers, high performance computers. When I first heard about this computer to be on our campus, I was so excited. I took my son to the opening ceremony, and he was like, at the beginning, he didn't want to go. But at the end of that ceremony, just looking through the history of the computing development capabilities, and he's at the end of the thing, on the way back, he said, "What's the difference between a classical computer and a quantum computer?" And I said, we already did it, right? Curiosity drives innovations, and we are already halfway there just because we already have it on campus. We have access to that for all our students. So I'm beyond excited right now. Our curriculum will follow just as much as research that we're doing right now.
So, Brian, you're going to get the harder questions. There's multiple ways of building a quantum computer. I don't know what they are, trapped ions and photonics. And I guess now Microsoft has come out with the topological computer. Can you talk a little bit about these technologies and why that's so exciting? And I always tell people never to ask two questions at once, but like, when is it going to work?
Right. So the first question, we take a step back and we ask, what is computation, right? What are we doing in everything that we do? At its core, computation is managing a flow of matter and energy in a way that represents information. Okay, so we're processing information with matter and energy. We sometimes forget about that when we're surfing the internet on social media or looking at YouTube videos or whatever. But at its core, we are processing information in the form of matter and energy. When you do that on the classical computer, we're working with these things we call bits, tiny little switches in a silicon chip that represent a 1 or a 0. And as we add all these things up, each of these bit patterns, these numbers represent some piece of information that we're interested in working with. So if we start to look at natural systems in nature, atoms, molecules, nuclei, photons, and some non-atomic systems as well, what happens is, in order to represent the total number of states you have to work with, right? How can all the electrons be configured in an atom? How can all the nucleons be configured in a nucleus? How can all the delivery trucks I need to send around with sending my packages, what's the best way of allocating those, right? The number of possible states of information to represent in systems like that scales exponentially, like Nathaniel was talking about before. So representing that on a classical computer, you eventually run into fundamental limits. So if I take 2 raised to the n power, where n is the number of things I have to deal with in my problem, once you get to about 2 to the 50, you're talking a big leadership class supercomputer that you need to represent that amount of information. Now with a quantum system, there's something special happens called superposition and entanglement. So superposition is this idea that you can mix states together. It's a little more complicated than that. For sake of discussion right now, we'll call it a mixture. So you can take one qubit, which is a quantum bit, and represent a superposition of 0 and 1. So that's one unit of matter representing two possible states of information. So if I have 2 qubits, I can now represent 4 states. So I have n qubits representing 2 to the n computational states. So as you add the number of qubits, the number of computational states you can work with grows as that 2 to the n, but the number of units of physical matter that you're doing that on is still only n. So I only need 50 qubits, which might be 50 atoms, because these things physically are very tiny. So it replacing an exascale supercomputer data center. 70 qubits representing paving the whole earth with data centers. Now I only have 70 little atoms that are doing that, right? So you can see now where the power of this comes from. Now, what do you physically do this with depends. This is like an ideological argument sometimes of which qubit is the best one that's going to win. Nobody really knows right now because they all have their own benefits and drawbacks. By and large, though, when it comes to knowing how these things work, so the physics is done, right? So the physicists will say it's an engineering problem. We're a school full of engineers, so that means it's our problem. And so that's why we're looking at this stuff now. The fact that we have this machine dropped in our lap on campus is a unique opportunity because we no longer need to worry about building the physics up from scratch. It's been done. We can look at it, we can appreciate it, we can understand it, and understand how it all fits together in this stack. But now we can start seeing how does this stack fit together for us to build useful things on top of it.
Yeah, I'd like to add something because as an investor, I don't like seeing other investors get burned. There's many different ways of making a qubit. In the end, there's going to be one right way. Each one of them today has their pluses and minuses, and you want to have fun, get someone from one company arguing with the other one, and it turns into a shouting match because the people that work at them are firmly in belief that the way they're doing it is going to be the one that wins. But in the end, just like all material systems, there's one better way to doing it. And right now, people are getting very excited about quantum, and there's been a run-up in a lot of these quantum stocks. There's a couple of them public. One's called Rigetti. One's called IonQ. There's another one called D-Wave, which is an annealer. It's not really a full gate qubit system. But some of these things are trading out. Rigetti was a 50-cent stock. People thought it was going to go to bankruptcy, and the stock's now up like 20-fold. These things have become meme stocks. They trade at outrageous multiples, 30 to 50 times 2027 revenues. And what's not priced into them is the risk that they might be zeros because they may not be the right way to build it. And just as an observer, having looked at the space and all the private and public companies, it was very interesting to me that Google came out with this thing called the Willow chip, demonstrating for the first time that as I add an additional qubit, every time I add a qubit, I add noise. But do I get enough gain and error correction that the noise of the system goes down? The first time you need to have that because you need lots and lots of physical qubits to do error correction to make something called a logical qubit. That Willow chip demonstrated that first step in that direction. Google is like IBM and Rigetti, they're superconducting qubits. Now, what's interesting to me is Google just participated in over a $200 million financing in a company here in the Boston area called QEra, which makes neutral atom qubits. Now, why would you do that right after you announce your Willow chip? They're hedging their bets because they're not confident that their way is going to be the one that wins. And no one should be confident that their way is it. So I admire Google for at least having the guts to do it. I'm invested in a company called PsiQuantum, and Microsoft just made waves with their new chip. But guess what? Microsoft's an investor in PsiQuantum. They're hedging their bets too. Google just made this big noise with their Willow chip. IBM has installed a lot of their ones. Rigetti is the third horse in the superconducting qubit race, and it trades at 50 times 27 sales. So you're looking for short ideas. I think I might have one for you. Yeah.
Sticking with the investment phenomenon, not only do these smaller entrepreneurial companies doing it Google's doing it, and they've been doing it a long time. Now we find out Microsoft's been doing it a long time. Amazon's been doing it a long time. And Honeywell has been doing it a long time. IBM is a leader in quantum. These companies aren't pursuing fusion because fusion has been 50 years away for the last 50 years, right? It's just a very difficult problem. But quantum is the kind of thing where you're going to cure every cancer. So the winner wins big. And really, society is the winner. Like, fine, 10,000 people at Google get fabulously rich, but the world gets fabulously rich when this works. And my opinion on this is you go to RPI or any other school and you work on the wrong technology, fine, you're only going to make 400 grand a year when you get out. Because there's a massive supply demand imbalance. And this is so complicated that I've been trying to study it for 7 weeks. And I literally know nothing. So this, just studying this, and you want to be a management consultant, you want to be assistant to the CEO or whatever, this is the type of complex, cutting edge education that will prepare you literally for anything, med school, law school, doesn't matter what it is.
I'll add on to the hardware discussion a little bit and say that looking back at the history of classical computing, look at where computing was in the 1950s, right? IBM is still around. Google wasn't even a glimmer in anybody's eye at that point. The future over the long term still remains to be written. And the computers at that time were vacuum tubes. What we're building right now in quantum is still vacuum tubes. The first quantum computer that has these vacuum tubes of quantum computing could be used to design the transistor of quantum computing, which would once again change the game. So the overall objective is to give everybody that familiarity with how these things are put together. What's the quantum computing stack, as it were, and build useful things on top of them, regardless of whichever hardware wins out in the end. Because I think at the end of the day, those abstractions all come into place, and then you can do things with the technology that doesn't matter what it's built at.
I think there's a good example from when the computer was first unveiled, where a bunch of old RPI grads were coming by and seeing the computer, and they kept on comparing it to punch cards. They would come in and they were like, yeah, when I was here, when I was a student, we had this massive IBM system in our basement. We'd come in with our punch cards, we'd put them in for a day, wait, come back, grab, and then do it again. I think that's a great kind of comparison to where we are with it right now.
So, Lucy, do you have any advice for admitted students? Any advice for the students?
Right now, the students have plenty of resources to learn, right? It really comes from many sides. Besides applications, there's also theory. Theory it needs to be fundamentally built from the mathematical side, coming from the physics side, from chemistry side, and there's just so much that you need to build up, right? So from every level. So as you come in, RPI has, I mentioned there are many courses that are currently available. I would just say join the Quantum Club, come and do some research with professors. I have students already come to me and work on the different aspect of quantum computing. So research projects and clubs and certainly all these courses that are available, and then just explore together. That's the fun part of that process, is that we're all learning together. We're looking at different sides of it, coming from software side, hardware side, materials side. It's just, there are many things that you can work on, explore, and you don't know what you're gonna, right? You just talk to people. So many resources available.
Further illustrating the parallel processing and the 2 to the n, there's a famous parable where the farmer saved the kingdom, and as a gift for saving the kingdom, the emperor said, "Mr. Farmer, I'm going to grant you any wish." And the farmer said, "My only wish is that you get out a chessboard and you put 1 grain of rice on the first square on the chessboard, and then double it, put 2 grains of rice on the second square, and then double it and put 4 grains of rice on the third square, and finish it for all 64 squares." And the emperor was like, "You are a very modest and gentle man." Then he figured out that was more than all the rice in the universe. And that's why these things work so fast. It's that power of 2 to the n in parallel processing that makes it so crazy. 15 years from now, we're going to have advances in quantum computing. We're going to have massive advances in AI. What does that mean?
I have no clue, honestly. When you look at AI within the context of quantum, what does that mean? And that's really tough to get your brain wrapped around in my mind. One question I have for Mark and Brian, because I think this is really important, is the timing of all this. And when do you think, and Mark, this ask your question, when do you think that the winners will become more obvious? Do you think that's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years? Or do you think it's going to be further out than that? Because once that happens, everything changes dramatically, right? And all the emphasis then gets on what you can do with it, not how do you build it, how do you get rid of the errors. And then manufacturing kicks in, everybody starts jumping on that bandwagon, and the world just takes off. But if you think it's going to take the 10 to 15 years to get those winners, then the world's not going to be much different than it is now.
I think we will see a real fault-tolerant quantum computer within 3 to 5 years. There's a couple of different podcasts you can listen to. One's a great one, an HBR one from 2021, where they interviewed the CEO of PsiQuantum, and he says, if you took every atom of silicon on planet Earth and turned it into a giant supercomputer that had another 200 years of Moore's law, 100 logical qubit machine would have trillions of times more compute capacity. So it's beyond anything that you can really even wrap your mind around. Now, what that means is whoever gets there first is likely to stay ahead permanently. And just look at the difference between TSMC and Intel. What's the difference? They're about 1 to 2 lithography generations ahead, TSMC, and that makes them worth a lot of money, and it makes Intel maybe not a viable company. But if I have a 200 logical qubit machine, I have 2 to the power of 100 more compute power. That's 10 to the power of 30. That makes a 100 logical qubit machine a joke. It's a trillionth of a percent of the compute capacity of the one that's at 200. So whoever gets there first is likely to stay ahead. And I think these companies very quickly will get to tens of billions of dollars of revenue with 50 to 80% free cash flow margins. And people will value that company very quickly at $250 to $500 billion. Now, once you see a company worth that much, there's going to be a lot of people that go, give me $2-3 billion and I'll catch them. So I think there'll be one initial leader that emerges, which will accelerate funding of people that try to catch them, and maybe one will, because you may get there first, but you may get the 500 qubits and 1,000, you may at a certain slope, and maybe someone can come up at a slope that's 10 times greater. So we just don't know yet, but I think the value is going to be seen, I think, pretty soon, but it's not tomorrow. It's going to be somewhere around 2030. I think you'll really see it.
So just taking what you just said and then taking a look at what's happening in the world of AI today with these data centers growing beyond comprehension, right? And if you think that all of that computing power can be replaced by potentially one quantum computer of a much smaller footprint, then you start thinking about what are the implications of running AI on a quantum computer, right?
Brian, I want to ask you, my limited understanding of quantum versus classical computing is that in the short run, being in the next 20 years, the first few iterations of quantum that actually works, that it won't be replacing classical computing, because classical computing gets you an answer, whereas quantum computing gets you a probabilistic answer.
Quantum computing is, if you're familiar with the computer science terminology, Turing complete, which means it can compute anything that a classical computer can do. You generally would not want to do that, though, because quantum computers create an answer that is probabilistic in nature. So when we think of photons, we think of atoms, we think of any of these quantum systems, they actually behave as waves or wave-like probability distributions until we look at them. And that's the weird part of quantum mechanics, that we're not going to get into that philosophy discussion tonight. But when you look at it, you only get one digital answer, right? You get one particle that represents the state of that quantum system. So if you have a set of qubits and you measure it, you will get one register of zeros and ones. So if you want to get the overall picture of what that quantum state, that probability distribution looked like, you have to run many trials to get an answer. And so the trick, the fine print with quantum computing is you have to tailor your algorithm in such a way that your probability of getting an answer is peaked around the answer that you want. And so those advantages of superposition and entanglement that quantum computing gives you lets you amplify the amount of information that you're squeezing into those peaks. So you can converge to your answer faster than you would with a classical computer. That's where the advantage comes in, is being able to shape and manage these probability distributions with these wave-like interference effects that you then use to build up your answer.
And the reason that's so exciting, at least to me, is that if you think of medical applications, an 80 or a 90% probability of curing that or addressing that disease, getting that battery right for global warming. Wow, because eventually you're going to get the answer. So, is there a question that I have? I always liked when I was an investor and meeting CEOs of companies. At the end, I would say is, what's the key question that I miss? Because we've addressed some very interesting things so far, but what haven't we addressed?
How much does it cost to operate this thing?
What did RPI pay for their quantum computer? And that was a used one from IBM. It's like 10 million. 5-year lease at 75 million.
Where does it use? Like we're looking at work. His AI machines are $100,000 a day or so.
So if you go online right now on like IBM's website or one of the other hardware vendors, they have a per unit of time charge that you use these things for. So for reference, I taught a class on campus last fall where for the final project, students basically picked whatever application they wanted to implement on the quantum computer and went and did that. That group implemented a fluid dynamics calculation. So an example fluid dynamics calculation that they had found in the scientific literature and implemented that on the quantum computer and ran it. And so they got through the whole job. It took about 4 days. And they told me at the end of it, they said, Brian, if I had run this without the access to the on-campus machine, it would have cost $64,000. So that is a whole research grant's worth of work that they did in a weekend for free. The results they got, actually, some of them were null results the first couple of times around. So you could have just blown a whole lot of money on a null result without access to a resource like this. So that's a very unique experience that we have.
Importantly, for students, it's free. So I can run a bunch of jobs and not have to worry about it. So yeah, I've run my fair share of many $1,000 jobs for anybody that wasn't at RPI. And I didn't get any emails from administration telling me to stop what I'm doing immediately.
Really speaks to another topic. First of all, I think your tuition probably helps cover some of that, by the way. Maybe not quite free. But anyway, we've heard numbers of $3,000 if you're going to access an hour for cloud-based stuff. One of the real advantages is that most of the universities have to use cloud-based access to resources. It's expensive, it's limited, and good luck waiting for your job. And so you find that's a real problem with any other university who has access to quantum resources. And having your own quantum computer gets rid of those problems, right? To the student's point, it doesn't cost them anything, and they get tremendous access. So it really gives you, it's just a really strong benefit.
I have a mic here. I'm going to pass it around so that way we can all hear.
If one of the key hurdles to development of quantum computing is error correction, is Rensselaer going to be doing any work in that area?
Okay. From a theoretical standpoint, error correction is something that is taught and researched. But from the current hardware that we have, there needs to be a little bit more scale up in order for error correction to reach the critical mass needed to actually reduce errors faster they can accumulate. So that was what Google demonstrated earlier last year with their Willow chip, was that by linking qubits together in a certain way, they can reduce errors faster than they accumulate. So with the architecture that's on campus right now, the next generation will have that capability, I believe. Right now, we have to do something called error mitigation, which is you do some post-processing of your results to extrapolate back what the answer would have been without errors. You can also do something called error suppression, which is you add extra instructions to your program that stabilize the qubits and give them more likely to, or less likely to have an error when you read them out. So there's some tricks you can use right now before we have full error correction, but then follow-on generations will have more and more error correction added in.
Hi. So we talked a lot about different hardware, different physics for the solution, and there were references made to the application programming that would be needed to build systems that use the technology. Can you give some examples of what that might be or what those look, or even referencing comparing to existing frameworks? I'm having trouble picturing it.
Yeah, I've got a software company and we focus on business process management. The thing that interests me about quantum is when you get to optimization. You think about business process optimization, least cost routing, all these ways in manufacturing where you can optimize manufacturing output. You can really technically optimize a business's performance, right? You can optimize it against either cash flow or profitability or revenue or some parameter, right? And so when you think about trying to do that kind of optimization, it's driven by a lot of constraints. And so in the classical world, when you think of optimization, since they're really constraint driven, you typically need to water down your constraints or eliminate some just based on the processing capacity. But in the quantum world, you don't need to do that. So there's the promise of really being able to do much better optimizations with quantum. That to me is really near term. And Mark mentioned D-Wave, which is not full quantum. They're actually doing that today. And so we've actually built prototypes, quantum-based optimization, business process optimization prototypes using D-Wave today. The other examples that were given were materials discovery, those types of things. That stuff, when you talk about needing large number of qubits, that's the type of technology you need to start solving those problems. And that's stuff that probably 3 to 5 years away before the technology is really to start tackling those problems. Yeah.
Good use of the application of the technology. It's just the Brian and I think a couple other people were mentioning that we need application programming to support to build these applications. What's
With
the
the
framework?
application, from an optimization perspective, that would be an application you'd build, right? At that level.
Yeah, I was trying to get at
So if you want to step down a level and say, okay, what am I actually programming? Basically what you're doing is you're writing something called quantum gates that act on qubits. And so you can think of like classical logic gates like AND, NOT, OR, NAND, all that. It's a similar idea, but in quantum, they take the form of these, what are called unitary matrices. So there's linear algebra. So it's these linear algebra operations that operate on qubits. So that's the abstract way of describing it. Now, what literally happens is that under the hood, there's a compiler that takes your instructions. So we're basically writing assembly code at this point. It takes your instructions and then converts them into analog signals. So now it's an analog electronics problem. It converts your quantum gates into analog electronic signals that are then sent into the qubits that are sitting in the machine on campus. So it's microwave signals. They go to these physical superconducting qubits and causes them to change state according to the gates that you've applied to them. So all that stuff happens that actually make the quantum computation happen. And then to read it back out, you send one final microwave signal to it that then either gives a certain pulse if it's a 0 or a certain pulse if it's a 1. Then you save that in memory and then bring it back, and then that's how you get your answer. Then you repeat that over and over. All along that stack is a lot of room for improvement. We're in Gen 1 right now, Generation 1. So when we say about building the stack and the need for more application programming, it's coming up with better abstractions for that process.
The process you just mentioned of initializing all those gates, how long does that take for the quantum computer to do a cycle?
If you're not waiting in the queue, it's less than a minute. Once your job hits the queue, it's a matter of 2 minutes at most if you have a very complex circuit that you're trying to run.
That includes all those iterations till you find the correct answer.
Yeah. Now, if you're doing an optimization problem like Bob was talking about that has to iterate till it converges, that can take however long it takes to converge. But the single quantum program, single quantum circuit is about a matter of a few minutes to run.
So many things are very abstract and things like that, which is good. That's why RPI is great. Can we talk a little bit on physical side, putting a super quantum computers in the BCC? What are the physical, like how much power is actually drawn? And you're talking about 0 Kelvin in terms of temperature and things like that. Like how do you have to make it happen so that all the softwares and computations and people can be able to enjoy using the systems? I don't know if you can maybe speak to that.
It depends what you're using, right? So if you saw that chandelier before, right? So you got a chip down there, and it's what, like how many qubits in that chip? Like 20 or 30? 120. If you want to make 1 million physical qubits, right, in that chandelier, maybe eventually you'll get 10,000 in one of them, but then you're going to need 100 boxes, right? So that's cover maybe half a football field. It's going to be big. If you have 20 millikelvin, boy, you need a lot of power to do that. If you're doing a photonic quantum computer, I think eventually you'll be probably at 4 Kelvin. You'll be above the boiling point of helium, much lower cost. And then I think the neutral atom stuff is also, they use lasers to get the atoms to be very cold, but I think they're thinking they could put hundreds of thousands of qubits in something the size of a refrigerator, and that would require, I think, a lot less power. The answer is I don't think anyone. It really depends which type of system wins, and then what are the power requirements of that system. But there's no a priori answer up front.
Pascal claims you can take one of their boxes, plug it into the 220 outlet, 6,000 watts, and run their machine.
So if quantum
ranges.
if quantum computing is so powerful, why don't we see more?
Doesn't work yet.
Yes.
So one phrase I'll use to describe sometimes when I'm talking to students about the way to think about where quantum computing is these days is it's like a physics experiment with a Python API. If you look at where the field was in, say, 2016, when there were 5 qubits online on IBM's website that you could play around with, it has grown by leaps and bounds. It's now following up with the engineering to put all that stuff together and get to a point where we can use it to do these fault-tolerant computations and we're right on the cusp now of doing scientifically useful calculations, and then doing industrially useful calculations will take a few more years to get to the point where the technology can do that.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I was wondering if you could say more about the type of research that RPI is currently doing on the 127 qubit chip that you have, and if you have plans to fabricate your own devices to do different kinds of research.
So some of the research activities that I'm familiar of on the engineering side, for example, Brian mentioned one of my students. So we do computational fluid dynamics, and we also do materials modeling. So these simulations, traditionally, they're done with classical computers. I can tell you some of the simulations that we've done involving voice production. So that's one of the research projects that we've been working on for 10 years. If I just say, because I can't afford it, just a 2D representation looking at 1 second of voice production, it would probably cost me a whole month of running nonstop on a regular classical, very nicely parallelized computer. So that's one of the things we're looking into. How can I reprogram all of that using the quantum computers that we have? So that's some of the research that we've been working on to see what is the best way. And maybe the traditional way of doing regular finite element based modeling is no longer good enough. So I need to look at other algorithms that are suitable to do these type of fluid dynamics. So that's why some of the research that we're doing now is related to that at different scales separately, because we can't afford looking at a system level multi-scale materials modeling. That simply couldn't afford anything like that. But now we can. So with this and with the combination of classical computers and quantum computers, maybe we can separate the jobs. Some jobs classical computers do better, and we will look at that. And then some jobs like molecular dynamics, right? So at the atomistic level, quantum computer can do it really nicely. So how do we couple them together? Those are another area of engineering applications that we're currently looking at. And certainly there are also in the math department, people are looking at how to do these computational linear algebra better in order to fit into the quantum algorithm. Just depending on where you are and what kind of fundamental research that you're doing, there are all kinds of application-driven type of research areas. And of course, a lot of that depends on who's funding us as well.
Every single school at RPI, whether it's humanities and social sciences, science, engineering, architecture, everybody has research going on. We were trying to compile a list and give you a takeaway for today, and we couldn't finish compiling it before. And we'll send something out afterwards just so people know the different types of research that's going on all across the campus.
Yeah. Just in mathematics, calculating an eigenvalue off a huge matrix
Yeah, I just want to mention that the quantum computer's been on campus for a year now, and there's probably going to be a lot more opportunities for research as this sort of gets digested by the university. I know that they're still trying to sort out some basic stuff. Given the amount of research happening, even in the first year, it's pretty impressive. And I think that the next 2, 3, 4 years, as the university digests the stuff and gets it more built into its kind of DNA, you're going to see a lot more interesting research happening and a lot more funding happening because it takes time for these grants to get processed. So I think you're going to see some pretty amazing stuff over the next 3 or 4 years.
The question I have is, I think maybe in the investor area, GPUs have made a fantastic difference in the speed of processing. When you talk about comparing it to a traditional computer, does that also include using GPUs and parallel processing and the speed that process gives you compared to quantum computing?
In terms of the comparison of quantum versus GPU accelerators, I think it's an apt comparison in the sense that a quantum computer is another accelerator like a GPU, but they tend to be more of like a complementary technology rather than GPUs versus quantum. It's more like GPUs and quantum, depending on what you're doing. Some of the research that's going on in RPI right now is focused on how do you integrate a quantum computer with a classical high performance computer, with the supercomputing system that they have at the tech park. So linking those two systems together and then feeding back in real time the quantum result to the high performance classical computer, and then looping that information back to the quantum computer and so on. So it's like this big hybrid heterogeneous system because computing in general is on this march towards heterogeneity in terms of what each individual architecture.
So you could use quantum computing to actually speed that up considerably.
It becomes more about data movement, right? You have to decide what makes sense to leave on the quantum computer, what makes sense to put on the classical computer, and then within that, what goes on the GPU, what goes on the CPU, and so on. Right here.
Yeah, Lucy mentioned that, but if you think about when you go to try to solve a problem, it's not going to be obvious what's going to be better handled by a classical computer versus a quantum. But there's work being done to figure that stuff out automatically and then really basically divide the work between a classical and a quantum computer. And I believe that you need a high performance computer to sort of format and pre-process data before it's fed to a quantum computer and then fed back again. So there's still a high level of dependency there, and it's probably going to always be there, that hybrid architecture. It's probably all going to be there as it looks now.
It was a little bit comical. Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA, says, oh, quantum computing's 15 to 30 years in the future. And then the next week, he says, at our annual developer conference, the GTC conference, we're going to have a quantum day. And he invited 12 quantum compute companies to show up. So I think he's trying to knock down the valuations of some of the companies so they can buy a piece of them.
Yeah, once he has his own quantum chip, he'll change his tune.
I think the reason he says it's 15, 30 years in the future is that he knows he's behind here. Because that actually, of all the major companies, I don't think they have one. Intel's got a program, Microsoft, Amazon has one, Google has one, IBM, and Honeywell, and within the trapped ion approach, the Quantinium one is considered much to be the best in class one there. So I think it's a little bit self-serving. So I think he feels behind, and he's bringing all the quantum compute companies to him to try to get his GPUs integrated with them.
What does the current coursework look like that's related to quantum, specifically at the undergraduate level, and how do you see that kind of growing over the next couple of years?
So right now, they are individual courses. But the way we're incorporating that now in the curriculum is that people can just take it as free electives. This proposal, if we get funded, we call it concentration pathways that we can guide students to be there. There are collections of courses or pathways that we already designed for the students at undergraduate level to guide you there in terms of when do you take what and what kind of fundamental basic courses you need in order to get there. So it's all designed, not necessarily degree granting per se, but we're getting there. So the degree program that I mentioned, right now we're working on the master's level, undergraduate level, and PhD level are all under works at the moment as well. It might take a little bit time for the undergraduate, particularly because we have to go through the state and approval and all that. Typically, the turnaround time is a half a year. But regardless, If you're interested in just getting your feet wet and taking a few courses to explore, we have all of that. And if you want to do the concentration, like you say, if you're in my department, for example, you want to do a concentration in quantum computing or quantum hardware or quantum algorithm and such, that's very easy to do because we already have all those courses available. You just have to take them. And then Brian's class, that's also undergraduate level. So those are the things that are available.
So another thing that's important to point out, especially for undergraduates, is the availability of undergraduate research projects. I think as early as your second semester freshman year, you can work with a professor in whatever department you want to do research projects for pay or for credit, or even just for experience. You typically will work with that faculty member to develop like a project scope that'll last the semester or the summer, and then spend that time doing it. People have come up with all sorts of different things using the quantum computer. Like they came up with their own mini version of RSA and then their own mini version of Shor's algorithm to try and break it. And then lots of other little projects like that.
Yeah, I think also importantly, it's very accessible to undergrads, and there's also a lot of resources online to at least get all the original information, like how to code on it, how to do all the small things, and then you can go and engage with all the course material and the undergraduate professors that are offering a lot of research. Importantly, as well, this is like all the kind of professors are offering undergraduate research and will include you in these small little projects that they can. They'll give you a small piece of what they're doing, which is real work in the field, and get your experience in there.
So that's getting close to the question that I had. Online courses in this area that would be accessible to non-students?
We do. The director for our Rensselaer at work. So
We have an online course called Intro to Applied Quantum. Brian is teaching that course. I watch a lot of online videos about quantum computing to learn it as a mechanical engineer. I have not met a single person who makes the topic more accessible than Brian. And so you'll be able to take that course. It's 8 weeks. You'll have synchronous sessions every few weeks, and you'll be able to on demand meet with Brian and pick his brains. That's the online course that we currently have.
I've been working with also IBM, so on the educational side of things. So IBM educational department are calling RPI as their premier customer. So basically we got to a point where they come over and then said, what do you need in order to put a curriculum together? What kind of resources do you need? Do you want us? They've already come up with a lot of segmented online training and courses already, and they're accessible to RPI students, and I believe some are accessible to everybody. There are certain set of courses that they're currently developing, and they are also consulting with us and then developing more. So those will be all accessible to RPI students and faculty. So I'll be taking those.
So you look at a quantum computer and you're thinking, I'm probably not going to have that on my desk, right? So I'm wondering if any of you could speak to, as we think about quantum computers meeting the needs that industry has, what is that business model going to look like, do you think, of using them, getting how businesses are going to use them, how they'll be deployed?
My best guess, it's not going to be about making a lot of machines. It's about getting the machine you make and making it go up in number of qubits, because then the problem you can solve goes up in value. They're going to take a piece of the action. They'll say, I want 5% of your revenues for the molecule we find. And that's where they're going to get, we think, that very high profit margin. They'll just take a piece of the whole economy. I literally believe that within 15, 20 years, that quantum compute company will be the entire pharma industry. The existing pharma companies will maybe just be distribution, but the people that are going to own the molecule, it's going to be that quantum computing company. I'm not saying short the 3 trillion of value drug companies out there, but I think, and at first they'll probably initial partner, they'll be co-own the molecule and all those things, but as time marches on, the computational power, as it keeps getting amplified by adding more qubits, it's just the power is going to shift more and more to the people that own the IP. That makes that incredibly powerful cloud computer.
As an investor, I mostly agree with that. Yeah. It might be 50% of the winner might get 50% of the pharma industry, or they might get 90, but it's going to be big.
So to get into the weeds, is a qubit identical as in all of them identical like a textbook, or are they just a physical phenomenon with certain properties that we can measure and work on? Does it depend on how they're made? That is, whatever mechanical or electrical systems are used to create them.
So the answer is yes, but the more complicated answer is you can use what nature gives you, right? So a qubit is any quantum system where we have two addressable levels or two addressable states, right? So it could be like the spin on an electron. Nature gives us that, it's just up or down. It could be the energy levels in an ion or an atom, right? Those are, once again, based off what nature gives us for, rubidium atoms or strontium ions or whatever. Superconducting qubits, which are what are sitting on campus at RPI right now, are engineered systems. With an engineered system, we can pick the levels we want to match the control equipment that we can build, right? We don't need special lasers that are very finely tuned to the strontium resonance or whatever to work with ions or atoms. We can build microwave generators that work at frequencies that we know how to operate and have well-worn methods for building that equipment. The trade-off is they're not all going to be the same, right? You build them in a fab. Your fabs have some natural variability associated with them, so you have to do lots of QA and testing to make sure they all fit within some bound that they're going to give you the right performance. But they're also, because they're solid state and they're superconducting, they also work a little bit faster. So if you think of a clock speed, superconducting qubits tend to be faster than, say, trapped ions, which operate more on like the kilohertz time scales, just because of how the energy levels in those systems are. Whereas the superconducting qubits are more like nanoseconds to microseconds time. So physically, the clock speeds of these things are actually slower than you would have with a classical CPU, but that's made up for by the scaling that you get from this 2 to the n effect by having all the state space you have access to.
I'd just like to know if you're going to make your quantum computer available to some of the kids here tonight, maybe through your quantum club.
I'm not sure the policy of RPI for non-students to have it. You can very much go and sign up for the IBM systems, and you can use those for free. There's a couple of minutes of compute time you can use, and you can run a lot of these sample programs to see how these algorithms work in principle. Beyond that, it starts to get a little expensive, but definitely for students, it's free.
IBM does have some free things that you can sign up for in quantum.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. With a classical computer, the amount of parallelism that you can have is determined by the number of CPUs, even despite massively parallel scientific computers. With quantum, isn't it potentially the degree of parallelism unlimited? Or is it determined by the number of qubits?
I think it's a function of the error correction.
Yeah, when you think of a classical CPU or cluster where you have parallelism, you have multiple threads of processing that are working on the problem independently with shared memory or separate memory spaces. So if you have a quantum computer, it's a little bit different. With a quantum computer, this example of the maze sometimes shows up where it's, okay, if I try every path of the maze one at a time, that's the classical equivalent of what I do. With a quantum computer, it's, I try all the paths at once. It's not exactly how it works. What it's actually doing is this probability distribution, right? So you have this entry point to your maze, you have this exit point to your maze, and you have all these different paths through it. What you're trying to do when you're searching through it is you're trying to find the most probable path that will take you to the exit. So it's more like you're applying quantum gates and operations that light up all these different paths if you visualize it. The path with the most probable exit route will be the brightest one, and all these other ones will be dimmer. And then when you go and take a measurement of that system, it'll snap to the path that actually gets taken. And then you do that many times to build up the statistical distribution of what really happens.
I didn't understand that because I thought the question was, why can't you just add more qubit chips? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the degree of parallelism determined by the number of qubits? Is it almost unlimited as to what you can go?
which is what the great potential is there.
Yeah, it's more like as you add a single qubit. So if I have 20 qubits, if I add 21, that state space I have access to in the computation goes up it doubles, right? So it's that 2 to the 21. So yeah, as you add a single qubit, it compounds on that whole computational space that you're working with.
But I still don't get it. Why can't you just add one? They're working with 20 and 50 and 70 qubits. Why don't they have 5,000 qubits?
That's the engineering problem. Physically, as you add more qubits, now you have more stuff to manage in terms of your signal generators, your lasers, your couplings between them. You want to be able to couple qubits together in a way that you can create that larger state space, but you want to do it in a controlled way. So if you don't have control over that, you can get crosstalk, which leads to errors. And it's all about managing these errors as you add more qubits. So when you get to the point with error correction, that's when, by adding more qubits, your errors will decrease accordingly.
Well, you've got great schools that you can go to, including RPI. If you go to RPI, it's a problem-solving education, and that's what employers are looking for. RPI will bring you the problem-solving thing, and on your own, just work on your personal dynamics and your ability to function on teams and that kind of thing. You're going to have unbelievable job opportunities going to RPI, and the grad schools particularly love it.
I think also a good example. So I'm a sophomore right now, and last year was my freshman summer. I got an offer from IBM Quantum to go work with them on their education team, where I helped write some of the courses that they're working on. But yeah, it's like you do get a lot of opportunities just by being involved in a small school that gives you access to research and gives you access to the professors that can spend their time with you to make sure you understand what's going on.
You all probably thought he was a senior, right? Sophomore. I'm just going to do a quick wrap up. Can we start by thanking the panel and Ethan and spending time at this?